Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin here with a knife video for you. I'm going to try to be as fast as I possibly can, guys, but I bet you this is going to be a long video. I want to talk about locks, okay? And there are a bunch of different locks, and I've got a bunch to show you, so I'm going to try to move through them, talk about strengths, weaknesses, pluses, minuses, all that kind of stuff. But please bear with me, guys. The other thing I would like to say is I won't be able to go into great detail about every single aspect of every one of these locks. There's just no way. So what I would ask you to do is, hey, if there's something you've missed, if there's an experience you have, if you've got a knife that does a certain thing and bothers you or does something else that you just love, go ahead and add it in the comments below so that other people can see, hey, here's another feature of this lock that you might appreciate, or here's something about a certain lock that you may not appreciate or may even want to avoid. All right, so that's number one. Number two, before we sort of actually get into these locks, is no lock is 100%, okay? All of these locks do function. They all keep the knife from closing on your fingers, but every one of these locks should be treated as if it is like this one, okay? And obviously what stands out about the Swiss Army knife is there's no lock, okay? If I push on the back of this blade, it's gonna close, all right? And so obviously when I use this, I use some care to make sure that doesn't happen. And guess what? If you're using this knife or this knife or one other one that I've got on the table here, you need to exercise that same level of caution, because any folding knife can fold. There are a million things that can happen. And so just always treat a knife that can fold as if the lock doesn't really work. This is the only knife that you should use for anything that requires negative pressure, that is pressure being applied to the back of the blade, okay? Because here's a knife, you know, and what I'm doing right now, you know, even this, I wouldn't do this with the other knives that I've got here because it wouldn't be safe, okay? So that gets sort of that stuff out of the way. The other thing that I want to say about this before we sort of get into specifics is that all of these locks are good, okay? I'm not going to try to tell you that one beats all the others, okay? I don't believe that for myself. I haven't experienced that myself, okay? Yes, some locks are stronger than others, there's no question, but that may not be the only thing you look for. For example, although the Manix, the lock is very strong, okay, it can't be actuated with one finger the way an actual Benchmade Axis lock can, okay? So strong lock, but is it perfect? No. On the other hand, the compression lock is super fun to open and close. You know, you can, the Para II is known to be a knife that people love to flip, love to open and close, you know, and frame locks are the same. You know, another good example, there you go, a knife that flips well, it closes easily, and people will open and close this knife over and over and over again dozens of times. So sometimes a lock that's really strong isn't as easy to use, and sometimes a lock that's really easy to use isn't as strong. Sometimes a lock is strong and easy to use, but maybe it's not as fun to flip or not as sort of addictive, okay? Probably a lot of back locks, people would say, you know, back locks are great, they're really strong, but you know, I like to flip my knives open and closed all day, and the back lock doesn't allow for that very well. All right, maybe speed is something else that gets considered here. So there are a lot of things, there are a lot of features that we care about that will be good, positive and negative about different locks. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And why don't we get started with a lock that's a little different? All right, this is the Freeman button lock flipper. The name is just a description. It is a flipping knife. It is from Freeman Outdoor Gear. Very, very cool knife, but it has a button lock, okay? Now, button locks are not uncommon, and there's some guys who really like them, and there are a lot of reasons to like them. It's a very small, very simple piece of engineering, and because of its small size, it gives you a lot of freedom to do different things with your knife. Now, the problem with button locks is that they require a fairly high degree of precision, okay? If something is even just a little bit off about the way this lock is designed and built, it will not function well, and you'll get blade play like you get in, you know, CRKT puts button locks in a lot of their Brian Ty collabs. I've never had one that didn't have blade play. Now, it's usually not severe, but it is usually there. Hogues and stuff like that, more expensive knives, certainly this knife, or a custom Brian Ty, you don't get that because the level of quality, the level of fit and finish is where it needs to be. But button locks are great. They're really cool because they don't interfere with the blade in any way. So this can be very, very smooth. All right, it's not like certain locks where there's always some interface. These locks can be very, very smooth, very, very easy to actuate. Now they can, and this one has just a little bit of lock stick, and that does happen with button locks from time to time because there's quite a bit of surface area of contact between the knife and the button, okay? And with that added surface area, there is the potential for lock stick, and we'll say that on a few others. So button locks, they're good. They're not that common. And part of the reason they're not that common is they have to be really, really well done in order to function properly. Let's go on to something else. Frame locks are extremely popular. So why don't we look at frame locks next? So this is the Boker Federal. It is a titanium frame lock. What that means is you've got the frame of the knife and the lock bar is just cut out of the frame. It's integral, okay? And so this knife, when the blade opens, this little lock bar just pops over, and if this is the bottom of the blade, this is the lock, it pops in like this so that now the blade can't close because the lock bar is in the way. You move the lock bar out of the way, the blade can close no problem, okay? So fairly simple in its function. By the way, there are a number of locks that work that way: frame lock, subframe lock, liner lock. They all use the similar principle, and there's probably more that I'm not thinking of. So they're all great. They do have some weaknesses, okay? Number one, if this radius is not cut right, or I mean if this cut in the top of the lock bar and the bottom of the blade, if the angles are off, you know, if you've got something like this, or this, or this, you know, it's not gonna work. Okay, so it has to be well done. And because of the possibility that a minor variation can make the lock not work right, you do get things like lock stick, you get things like lock rock, you get lock slip, where the lock moves a little bit when you put pressure on the knife. And you get that both positively and negative. Some knives, when you go and cut something and you put a lot of pressure there, it puts back pressure on the blade and the lock further engages, and then when you stop, it kind of pops back over. And I think I've had a knife that did that. I just can't remember which one it was. But so there are a number of potential problems, even potential failure. If this lock face is not cut right, this could, let's say you apply pressure to the blade, this thing could slide off totally, and the blade just close on you. Okay, so all of those are potential problems with any knife that uses, you know, a lock popping into the tang that way. A number of different ways, a number of different offerings have been made to try to solve that problem. One of the things that's a benefit is when you're using this knife, guess where your hand is? It's right here holding that lock in place. Now, they have done some testing. If you saw Cold Steel's testing when they did the 0300, the 0300 failed right there at the relief cut. Okay, let me give you another knife so you can see. There you go, at the relief cut. Another issue with this lock is that over time you're going to get some wear. So you've got these two pieces of metal, one piece of titanium, one piece of steel, and over again you got this, they're sliding. Well, guess what happens? You slowly wear that down, and as you wear it down, the lock moves a little further over all the time. I've had this knife for a while. It's at about 55% lockup, and it started at probably 40. Okay, so by the way, there is a solution to that. It would be here's a good one you can see well. It would be a stainless steel lock bar insert like what's in here. Now you have steel on steel, and there's going to be less wear over time. Plus, if the wear ever gets to the point that it's interfering with the function of the knife, you can take this out and put in a new one. Okay, so there's that benefit as well. That's frame locks. They have strengths, they have weaknesses. They're very popular, of course. Frame locks are, you know, almost as popular as where we want to go next, which is liner locks. Before I do, I'll say a couple quick more things. Sometimes frame locks, if they're not well engineered, they can be hard to actuate. That is, hard to get a hold of the lock bar, you know, so you really, I'm exaggerating. I can do this with one hand, but this is a lock that's a little hard to get to, and that's pretty stiff. And so because of that, it can be a little tough to actuate. An example of one that's a little easier is this one. Okay, so frame locks. All that means is the lock is part of the frame and that you have a lock bar that pops over under the blade. Here is a subframe lock, okay, and that is, instead of this being integral, this piece of stainless steel is bolted onto this aluminum frame after, and it serves as the lock bar. So essentially the lock bar is a different part, and there's a good advantage to that in that when this wears, it's like those lock bar inserts. You could replace it and your knife is back up to sort of 100% functionality. Now let's carry on to, I know I'm trying to move fast here, guys. If I do miss anything, go ahead and comment below. Liner locks. I want to do liner locks now because they work the same as a frame lock, right? Essentially, instead of a frame, you now have a stainless steel, you have stainless steel liners, and those liners, one of them has a cut, like the cut in a frame lock, okay? And that cut creates this little lock bar. Now, again, they function the same way, so all of that stuff about angles and interface and all that stuff applies as well. I will say this, I'm not a fan of radiused interfaces, so I don't like, okay, the Boker Federal has this. You won't be able to see it maybe on camera, but this cutout in the bottom of the blade is rounded, okay? And it's a way of dealing with, or of slowing down, or hopefully slowing down that wear that happens over time. The problem is most people have noticed that that lends itself to, as it wears over more and more, you're going to get some lock slip happening down the road. So liner locks. Liner locks are found in a lot of cheaper knives, and so sometimes they get associated with cheaper stuff. They're really not. You know, I would submit to you, Jason Brous, you know, a lot of Brous blades are liner locks, and they run, you know, $400 or $500, and they're very, very strong. You know, a knife like the VR71 or the T4, those things are tanks, okay? They're super, super strong. Even, I mean, most of Jason Brous's blades are pretty strong, designed to be able to be used really, really hard in a combat situation or something like that. And so, I point that out to say, hey, you know, a liner lock does not deserve the reputation of being weak or being cheap. Neither of those things are true. They can be very strong and they can be found in very expensive knives. They do have a lot of the similar weaknesses as frame locks in that sometimes the liner is hard to get to, sometimes the spring tension is very high, so it becomes difficult to disengage. I got this knife to demonstrate one quick thing. This knife has an added mechanism that's designed to stop this lock bar from being disengaged. Okay, so I'll use my hands again to make this demonstration. So here's the bottom of the blade opens, the lock pops over, and now the blade can't be closed because this is in the way, right? This is the lock bar. Well, you know, if there's some way of sliding this over or maybe pushing it off with your thumb by accident or whatever, how could we prevent that? Well, we could put something behind this to hold it in place, okay? And there are a number of knives that do that. Lion Steel has sort of this rotary lock thing. CRKT has this locks mechanism and the auto locks mechanism, and all they do is put a little piece of metal behind the lock bar so that it can now not be disengaged, okay? And you can do the same thing with other locks, and I'll try to demonstrate that when we get to some of those other examples. So liner locks, again, they're good, they're comfortable. I have no issue with liner locks, and I don't think they should be avoided, even though it seems like sometimes as we move to more expensive knives in our collection, the liner locks get left away. That doesn't need to be the case. Okay, so what's next on the list? We've talked about it, got it. Okay, let's talk about a knife that's a little different. This is a back lock, okay, but instead of being a typical back lock, which has like a tooth that pops into the back of the blade, in this case, the tooth is actually on the blade. There it is there. And that tooth pops up under behind this metal strap. And so this is called a strap lock. It's designed by Grant and Gavin Hawk. Very, very good lock. This knife, the Buck 830 Marksman, is a great knife. And that lock is going to be really, really strong. Metal in tension, okay? Where with our other knives, with the other locks we've talked about, pretty much the button lock is not exactly, but most of the time we've talked about metal in compression. That is, it's being subjected to a crushing force. Now, this metal is being subjected to a stretching force. So for this lock to fail, this strap would have to stretch and deform to the point that it actually released this blade. So that's going to be quite a bit of pressure required to do that. Not that it's not possible, and in fact, a lot of locks that use back locks also use metal in tension, okay? And so back locks, because of the bent tooth, so in a back lock, you've got this thing, here's the blade, and this pops in. And when you try to push the blade, this can slowly be bent up, and then bang, the blade can fail, okay? And so it does happen, you know, stretching and bending can happen. It's not really common. Most of these locks, again, are very, very trustworthy, but metal in tension can bend. Now, metal in compression is more reliable, which is why the Triad lock, okay, is extremely strong. Now here's a back lock, Spyderco Endura. This happens to be the titanium and Damascus Endura, which, by the way, I just love this knife. I really, really do. I waited a long time for it. When I heard it was coming out, I put it on my list, and I just waited until finally when they were released. I was like very, very early on, picked one up, and I was super excited. And I still am. I love this knife. I just get it out and kind of look at it and fondle it. I carry it the odd time, not a whole lot. It does have a back lock. And so in here you have this lock bar, and it works just like I was describing. Pops into the back of the blade, into this little gap, and keeps the blade from closing. So that lock bar is under tension, and it can bend, it can deflect. Let's talk about another back lock, the Triad lock. The reason this can't deflect is because the lock bar is trapped between the tang of the knife. So here's our typical back lock, right? So if I put a lot of pressure on the blade, this can bend. But in the Triad lock, there's a stop pin right here. So now when you put tension on the blade, it's transferred through this little tooth, which is now under compression between the blade and the stop pin, and metal in compression is very, very strong. Okay, so the Triad lock becomes a very, very strong lock, and Spyderco Cold Steel has gone to some pretty great lengths to show us just how strong it is, and that's really cool. I like the fact that they do that. All right. Thinking of compression, here is the compression lock, Spyderco Paramilitary 2. This knife like single-handedly popularized this lock, and it has been called a reverse liner lock, a backward liner lock, but that's not at all what it is. It's more like a piston lock, which we're going to talk about in a second, where you have something that pops in between the back of the blade and a stop pin, or the back of the blade and the frame, and stops the knife from closing. And that's exactly what you have happening in the compression lock. You have a little tab on this lock bar, and when you open the knife, the tab pops into place, and it's between the stop pin, which is right here. You can see the stop pin there, and the tang of the blade. You can see the gap in the blade right there where the little tab pops in. Okay, so there it is. And that little tab is now under compression, which is why this is called a compression lock. And you only have a small piece of metal under compression, which makes this stronger than a liner lock. Okay, and here's why. Metal, when it's in, I'm going to use a piece of paper to try and show you this. Metal in compression, imagine this was a piece of steel and I was going to build a house, and so this is holding up the second floor. Put my floor on top of this and I start putting weight on it, and you see how it deflects. So that's what happens to metal in compression. How would I make this stronger? Well, you would want to reduce the amount of distance here. So you could do that. You could put two other beams that came in here and held this part straight, right? Or you could make this shorter. And so the shorter you get, the stronger that piece of metal is going to be in compression. And I'm pushing just as hard as I was a second ago, but now you can see there's no deflection. So in the compression lock, you have a really, really cool system where now you've taken a similar force, a compression force, but you've applied it to a very small piece of metal, which is therefore much less likely to deflect. Okay, so very strong lock, fun to actuate, guys. By the way, one of the things that this is good for is, number one, when you're closing the knife, your fingers are out of the way. when you're playing with the knife, the lock is very comfortable to access and actuate. So there's just a lot of stuff that's really well done on the compression lock, although it does seem to have limits. I would submit to you that the Spyderco Szabo, which has a compression lock, they seem to have had to re-engineer the lock to get it to work right, okay? So it seems like maybe you couldn't go a lot bigger than this and still have the lock working properly. When you get it to the size of the Szabo, maybe there was constant blade play, whatever issue they had, they seem to have to re-engineer it to get it to work right. All right, so piston locks are the last ones we're going to talk about, right? Yeah, I haven't missed anything. So here's my Benchmade Barrage, and it has the axis lock. And what a piston lock means is that when the blade opens, something pops into place here from this direction, going up and down like a piston. Okay, and now this bar in this case is behind the blade and it's locked into these two steel scales, and now the blade can't close. Okay, similar idea is found on the Manix. A similar idea is found on, you know, I didn't bring one with me. I should have brought the SOG, but the SOG Aegis, the SOG Visionary 2, the arc lock or the fake arc lock that never works right. Both of those are examples of piston locks. Obviously, you guys know my feelings on the fake arc lock that's found on like the Flash 2 and the Trident and a few others. It's just not very well executed, but they all work the same way. Something is being pushed from in the handle here up into the back of the blade, and in this case it's a ball bearing. Gerber has a wedge. Benchmade, which of course is the lock that everybody's copying with this, they use a steel bar pushed by Omega springs. They're all pretty functional. The axis lock is the best one. You know, it's the most reliable, it's the most comfortable, but even these locks are not perfect, okay? For example, I've never had a Benchmade that doesn't from time to time develop blade play. And what happens is, because you can see here's where the metal bar interfaces with the blade. See how this is open? So this is in your pocket, especially if you've got a little oil on here that makes it just a little bit sticky. Pocket lint and grit gets on that bar, or it gets on the back of the blade here, and then when the lock goes to close, there's a piece of foreign matter in there interfering with the lock interface, and it doesn't lock up right. So you get a little bit of blade play. You can clean it up and it'll go back to normal functioning, but it can be a pain in the neck. And I've had some Benchmades that were really bad. The Contigo, because the blade is more exposed than other Benchmades, it will almost always, every time you put it in your pocket, you take it out, something is lodged in there. When you go to open the knife, it interferes with the lock and you get a little bit of blade play. Again, it goes away if you blow it out or clean it out with something, it's gone, but it does happen a lot. So there you go, guys. That's a bunch of different lock types, pluses and minuses of a bunch of different lock types. All of these are locks that I like. All of them are locks that I use. There are knives like the 0560 where you've got the titanium. This has no stainless steel lock bar insert, so it's not perfect, but it's okay and I still like it. Let's see if I can find another one with a problem. So the cold steel locks, they're tend to be, although I will say a big improvement has taken place in 2015, but they can be, you know, hard to actuate. Sometimes you get a little lock stick. It doesn't matter, I still love it. The point I'm making here, guys, is, you know, although no lock is perfect, I think I mentioned earlier that this button lock can get a little lock stick from time to time. It's not severe, but it does happen. And so although no lock is perfect, pretty well all of them do a pretty good job. Just be aware, usually if a knife is really poorly done, you'll see lots of people talking about it, okay? Whether it be on forums, whether it be in YouTube videos like this, you'll get some warning signs, and that may be a good lock to avoid. Some of them do lend themselves to certain issues, and so you just have to watch out for that, okay? There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Go ahead and comment below with some of your experience with locks and either lock failures or real lock successes, ones that you really like that maybe you didn't think you would, and we will talk to you soon.